part of this regular intake interview, St. Peter asks what annual salary they receive. The best estimate, corporate attorney says, about $300,000. Standing next to him was a tall, thin woman who chimed in, I was a realtor. I made about $125,000 a year on average. When St. Peter turned to the third person, and she said, well, I made $15,000 a year, to which St. Peter interrupted, oh, cool, a musician. What instrument did you play?
That's terrible, Chris. Yeah, Chris. She said that'd be $5. Keep practicing. You'll get it. Following reading was a reading selection of Dr. Diana Archibald, whom I draw from in this sermon. The reading comes from chapter 3 of Charles Dickens' American Notes, a collection of thoughts he gathered on a trip to the United States in 1842. He went on a tour of the U.S., one tour in his life. Dickens begins, wherever religion is resorted to as strong drink, and as an escape from the dull, monotonous round of home, those of its ministers who pepper the highest will be surest to please. They who strew the eternal path with the greatest amount of brimstone, he said, and who most ruthlessly tread down the flowers and leaves that grow by the wayside will be voted the most righteous. They who enlarge with the greatest pertinacity on the difficulty of getting into heaven will be considered by all true believers certain to be going there, though it would be hard to say by what process of reasoning this conclusion is arrived at. Against fire and brimstone, essentially. When it comes to Charles Dickens, if you're a Dickens person, there essentially is a permanent, unfinished, unimportant scholarly debate about what religion it makes most sense to label, Anglican or Unitarian. It is essentially a very stupid debate. Dickens himself would have hated that we started and themed the sermon around today. Given that we're having a debate in contemporary culture about a lot of stupid events, I thought I would include this. So I want you to imagine being in an old country farmhouse on some like small-time reality television channel with TVs all about, so it's a colonial kind of home. The scholars from both sides are invited into this reality Big Brother kind of setting to live together there. ratings, I assure you, would be terrible. It might be important to mention that, just in case you don't know, that we know the Anglican Church here in America as the Episcopal Church. In my imagination, one of those who claim to be an Anglican says over the kitchen island to her gathered fellow eggheads, clearly Dickens during the second half of his life was enamored with Unitarianism and its values. There's no doubt about that. The camera's panning on her face. True, a stiffly dressed British Anglican cleric says, stirring a gin and tonic quite painfully. He unquestionably flirted with Unitarianism. To that more casually dressed, the Unitarian in a tweed jacket responds quickly with a touch of indignation. Flirted with Unitarianism? That's a bloody understatement. Clearly his birth and death as an Anglican was more of an expression of his cultural formality, family, and history as much as ideology. One of those who say Dickens was a Unitarianist scholar, Michael Timko. Timko, seated over at the hearth of this reality setting, chimes in. Look, all Dickens' novels reflect the central ideas of 19th century Unitarianism. First, in his work, we see signs of belief that Jesus was a human being who simplified a truly religious life. Second, he rejects the idea that God is chiefly describable as an agent of stern judgment. And third, he disclaimed theological controversies and dogmatic debates like this very one. Timto attempts to conclude but can't. His rejection of dogma, his desire that religions be inclusive, and his emphasis on works sounds pretty Unitarian to anyone living in the 1800s. I promise you that. Timko says with a voice of anger, it's really not that complicated. You can't think like a Unitarian, write like a Unitarian, and join a Unitarian church without becoming a Unitarian. The tension in this imaginary, scholarly reality show is getting hot. One of the handful of Anglican priests gathered wearing a clerical collar asked with disdain, just where, pray tell, are the quotes where our beloved Charles says such things? And there's a silence that fills the room. And then the well-coiffed Anglican scholar walks off indignantly. I thought as much. I'm going to the jacuzzi. All of those with half a brain, not interested in putting words in Sir Charles' mouth, are invited to join me. It being a reality show, everybody continues to drink, and that act of boldness leads the Unitarian scholar in the tweed to say, oh, you didn't just say that, except with a better British accent than I have. Oh, yes, he did, said the Anglican woman in a long wool skirt with her glasses propped up on her head. Dickens says almost nothing systematic about religion at all, followed by, even you know that. But let me ask you, just why, if he was such a committed Unitarian, was he not more vocal about his religious transformation? If our beloved Charles was a Unitarian, she says, slugging back the last gulp of her aged brandy, why did he rarely ever talk about it? And just why was he so committed to your upstart faith did, when Dickens retired to the country in his golden years, join the local Anglican church? Also, why can't you ever put your dishes in the sink? One of those who wish to claim that he was a Unitarian American pushes himself back from the counter angrily. I can't believe you. Sure, it's true that Charles rejoined a rural Anglican church, the church of his youth, when he moved out to the country, but everyone knows he likely did that because there were no nearby Unitarian churches. And oh, by the way, having rejoined the Anglican church, it might be important to the truth to know that he so quickly again grew disillusioned with the church quarreling there, that before long he stopped attending with any regularity. The Americans walk off in a hiss. Being a stupid debate, and being a debate imaginarily held in our time, I want you to imagine we might at this point break for an advertisement for Kim Kardashian's new German jeans, Junkum in Nun Trunkum. That was supposed to be funny. But when the action returns to a UU history scholar, who's argued that, on the face, argued, including Charles Dickens in a list of 200 Unitarians of importance. Harris' main argument is although Dickens grew up in the Church of England, he never really subscribed to their doctrines. Mark Harris, now commanding a cute little corner of this little cottage room. Whether or not Charles died a member of the Anglican Church is not really an issue as much as a technicality. What is clear and far more important, he says, is his affiliation and his affection with Unitarianism was no passing matter. In fact, up to the end of his life, Dickens remained close to many of his Unitarian friends. Harris' hands folded smartly across his chest adds, and formerly a Unitarian at his death or not, when he died in 1870, as Timko cites, who's sitting in the room. Almost idolatrous eulogies were heard all over New England for Dickens. As one Boston writer penned it, every Unitarian pulpit and immediately in the Boston area immediately sent him to heaven. Nice sermon, Harris, we hear the Anglican yell from the jacuzzi, nearly spilling his pint of hard cider into the water. That is truly convincing. You're welcome to wax on about how he never really adopted the core beliefs of his Anglican faith and birth religion as he did the Unitarian ones. Fine. Super. The unnamed Anglican is now yelling. Listen to this, he slurs with drunken excitement. Dickens was born into an Anglican home. He was baptized in an Anglican church. He died a member of the Anglican church and is, after all, predominantly buried in the most famous Anglican burial ground in the world, Westminster Abbey. Ever heard of it, Yankee? Added just because a little bit of the booze was talking at him. Yeah, he was a Unitarian, all right. As he's sitting down, he mutters, I can't believe I have to share this beautiful pastoral home with you idiots. Just then, one of the quieter members of the home and one of the Dickens was a Unitarian crowd, rushes into the room in his towel and nearly yelling, those who reject Dickens' commitment to Unitarianism probably fail to understand just how costly it would have been for him to publicly be vocal about switching faith traditions. Don't you get that? And the show mercifully ends on that note with an ad for British Airways. The trailer was thankfully not picked up. It should be noted that one of the reasons we even have these mostly silly questions about whether Unitarians or Anglicans can claim Dickens is because Dickens is not primarily an overtly religious person. After all, it's Dickens' lack of direct comments about his faith, rather than a glut of contradictory statements that have so many questioning his religious loyalties hundreds of years later. The real reality is that the end he probably most accurately would be called a free thinker who never adhered entirely to any one particular tradition enough for them to claim him. It might be simplest to repeat his descendant Lucinda Dickens Hawkinsley said in her bicentennial book about her famous great-great-grandfather. She wrote, if he showed any interest in religion, it was in the moral stance rather than in theological beliefs. Well, unless you're a Massachusetts resident, we have something of a trump card, and this is something you can carry home with you. I've not played yet. Here's where we can kind of puff out our chest. In 1848, when Dickens was in his early 40s, he visited America. Although he was not generally impressed with most of what he saw, Dickens praised Boston and its citizens, saying he would want the rest of America to be just like it. While in the hub, my words, not his, he met with three well-known Unitarian clergymen, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Andrews Norton, and stopped to have breakfast with one of Unitarians' leading figures, William Ellery Channing. Unbeknownst to Charles and William like him, Channing would die shortly after his breakfast with Dickens. Prior to the meeting, Dickens had read and been greatly impressed by Channing's 1819 sermon delivered at the ordination of Jared Sparks, which is like the start of Unitarianism. Unitarians have claimed to know this as the Baltimore Catechism. This soon was a broadly published sermon that laid out the principles of our movement back when it first got started. His work by Channing became the very words that largely outed Unitarians as a movement from the shadows. Channing's words, that was. In fact, the Victorian scholar Robert Newsom said that Dickens' interest in Unitarianism was virtually the only enthusiasm he brought back with him from America. Dickens returned impressed with the Unitarians' practical theology, and particularly the stance they'd taken against slavery. Immediately upon his return to London, Dickens began to attend services at the Essex Street Chapel, a Unitarian church. As Dickens described in a letter, "I've carried into effect an old idea of mine and joined the Unitarians, who could do something for human improvement if they ever could, and who practiced charity and toleration." Although Dickens' first church experience was in Essex, he eventually joined and more specifically bought a pew at the Little Portland Street Chapel in London, led by Reverend Taggart, also a Unitarian church. Dickens met the person who would soon be his reverend when he came to preach the equivalent of a tribute memorial service to Channing. Dickens appreciated the sermon and wanted to talk to Reverend Taggart about Channing, who he had just met, and they would become close friends. Reverend Taggart and Dickens bonded over similar feelings towards Channing and religion in general. In Dickens' words, they shared a disgust with our established church, the Anglican Church, and its daily outrages of common sense against humanity. Dickens shared with Unitarians a shared belief in the essential worthiness of humanity and critique of the theological concept that humans were depraved, and critique the humanitarianism of Unitarianism. Say that three times fast. The humanity of Unitarianism. It seems that what turned Dickens from an appreciated observer from a distance to a member. We must first remember Unitarians and Universalists were not joined together, for another 120 years at that point. In addition to being in alliance with Unitarian values, like so many of us, it seems Dickens had little respect for dogma or hypocrisy of any kind. In one editorial, he called the dogma of the Catholic Church a curse upon the world, and in another referred to the stables of the Christian faith as irrational. However, even more than his disdain for church doctrine, Dickens was always riled by self-righteous clergy and sectarianism. Here are some of Dickens' own critiques. The church's hand is at its own throat because of its doctrinal wrangling of the various parties. Here more popery, there more Methodism. Many forms of consignment to eternal damnation do not be found. It said that Dickens' disgust with such religious hypocrisy are expressed in characters like Mr. Gelsby in Bleak House and Mr. Pecksniff in his work Martin Chuzzlewit. As Dickens himself wrote in a letter in 1844 referring to Anglican, Catholic, and Methodist churches, he called them isms. Heaven for a world without isms, he said. The wickedness of it molds into us, each other, and as if to have brought a comet to our head. The truth is, Dickens was so interested in the role church played in society that he basically evaluated churches not on their theology, but what they attempted to do for social welfare. In fact, Charles had a Facebook page, and asked whether he was a Unitarian or anything else, he probably would have said it's complicated. Or not unlike any modern teen's dating status, flipped back and forth between Unitarian and Anglican. It's probably not a coincidence that it was upon his return from America that Dickens first attended that church, and also within a year or two wrote Christmas Carol, which clearly has a secular value system to it. The very idea that Christmas was a time to think of those who were less fortunate, and a time to gather around with families around tables in celebration, and Christmas trees, as much as going to church, Timko suggests can be as much attributable to the story as we might even think it is, maybe more. fact that Christmas is as much decorations and toys as a birthday for Jesus comes in no small measure from the impact of Dickens' tale. Although we may not notice it today, that impact is partially because of Scrooge's transformation. It's not fundamentally a religious one, is it? Scrooge's insight in Dickens' A Christmas Carol is not that he's lost faith, that he's found God or discovered Jesus as his Savior, but that he has broken relationships and responsibilities to his employees and fellow citizens, right? Scrooge asked, is Dickens not really illustrating the emergence of Unitarian values, that people are not inherently depraved based on their status? Timko sees in this Christmas classic the lesson that via the cultivation of one's own conscience that we see in Scrooge, essentially his readers and the culture along with them can be converted from harsh, complacent selfishness into a world of love and hope and charity. No real religion required. Larry Smith, a UU pastor, calls The Christmas Carol a classic expression of 19th century Unitarian values. I think he's right. In fact, after publishing his A Christmas Carol, mind you, not the Christmas Carol, but a Christmas Carol, he took heat from some of the evangelical communities that neither God or Jesus appeared in the story. Because of all these positions and sentiments and reasons, it's said that Dickens was a Unitarian. It's certainly true. He was a Unitarian, at least for a portion of the middle of his life. He was a member of a church. I think he's more of a Unitarian than that, but he unquestionably was at least that. What is clear is that Dickens did not exhibit the same kind of hypocrisy between the words and actions that he loved to pick at in his church. He did that. He was at least he wasn't mostly a hypocrite. After all, he worked tirelessly for a range of charitable causes, raising funds for soup kitchens, hospitals, prison reform, adult education, and disabled artists without touting himself or the Unitarian faith. How Unitarian is that at its best, right? And that is as Unitarian as any of it gets. For his social conscience, it could also be said he also left a wife and 10 children for an 18-year-old, and then when facing social pressure for that choice, saw fit to slander his wife as being an unfit mother, an act one of his many respected biographers called a true injustice. Heroes are nice. We need them. They're not perfect. Lynn Holbein, a former president of UU Mass Action that Linda and I worked with quite a bit, has this bumper sticker on her wall in her bathroom. It says, "To make the rich work hard, we pay them more. To make the poor work hard, we pay them less." Dickens would have loved and hated the irony of that bumper sticker. Alison Flood in the British publication The Guardian notes, Charles Dickens has been identified as the author of previously unattributable articles back in the day that attacked the middle classes for patronizing working people. In the unnamed stuff Dickens wrote, he says, "Who's not been outraged by observing that cheerfully patronizing mode of dealing with poor people which is in vogue in our soup kitchens and other depots of alms?" In another unattributed article, A Ghost, written by Dickens, it is believed, he urges readers to get into our heads that the working man is neither a felon or necessarily a drunkard or a very little child, but is charitable and is bold to defend the integrity and esteem of the poor, and as much as it's fair to ask if he should not have been bolder as a more direct result and advocate than he was, he never lost sight of the fact that through his writing was where his impact and social change could most take place. His compassion for the poor, as Diana Archibald said, is noteworthy. His commitment to giving voice to the silenced, generally unnamed people in our society is notable, and making visible and bringing life to the dead was truly remarkable. more an Anglican or a or a Unitarian does not matter. What I do know is that the issues that Charles' sooty-cheeked characters helped flesh out for us for conversation 150 years ago are a model of truth-telling that's not gone away. Perhaps when we think about social justice here, as we are doing, we might have one eye and ear open to how we can raise issues that support working people in creative ways. Perhaps using Dickens' great cast of characters as a platform, we might be inspired to bring to tell our own tales of stories of the travails of the economic machine that surrounds us. See, with the stagnant nature of the situation economically for poor people, maybe Dickens is the prophet of our moment. Amen.
If you see your brother standing by the road with a heavy load from the seeds he sowed, and if you see your sister falling by the way, just stop and say, you're going the wrong way. You've got to try a little kindness, show a little kindness, just shine your light for everyone to see. And if you try a little kindness, then you'll overlook the blindness of narrow-minded people on the narrow-minded streets. Don't walk around the down and out. Lend a helping hand instead of doubt. And the kindness that you show every day will help someone along their way. You've got to try a little kindness, show a little kindness, just shine your light for everyone to see. And if you try a little kindness, then you'll overlook the blindness of narrow-minded people on the narrow-minded street. You've got to try a little kindness, show a little kindness, just shine your light for everyone to see. And if you try a little kindness, then you'll overlook the blindness of narrow-minded people on the narrow-minded street.
But now your turn. Our closing hymn is in the teal hymnals, When the Spirit Says Do, 1024. Singing the Journey. kind of funny song in a weird way. Our closing words. Before we are gathered here again, may each of us bring happiness into another's life. May we each be surprised by the gifts that surround us. May each of us be enlivened by constant curiosity, and may we remain together in spirit till the hour we meet again. Please join us for coffee hour next door.